I am Liz Hancock. I'm in the communications team at MitoQ, and I'm here today with Professor Doug Seals. Doug is a distinguished professor of integrative physiology at the University of Colorado in the USA, and he is visiting us today here in our headquarters in New Zealand. Doug is an awarded scientist. He leads this is going to be a long spiel because you've got a lot going on. So he's an awarded scientist. He leads a large body of research with a particular interest in the areas of cardiology and aging, particularly as it affects blood pressure, arterial health and the vascular system, and exercise physiology. There's a lot happening there. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the areas that you specialise in and study, and also why you are visiting New Zealand at the moment?
Yes, I'm visiting New Zealand because I'm on what we call academic sabbatical, and I spent a month at the University of Sydney and University of Melbourne in Australia before coming here. And here I had a second sabbatical residency at the University of Otago. So that's really the main purpose why I'm in New Zealand at this point. The focus of our laboratory is actually to create evidence, scientific evidence, for various kinds of strategies that will promote cardiovascular health throughout the lifespan. So we're very interested in an emerging area of biomedical science, and that's healthy cardiovascular aging, and that's the primary focus of our research.
Fantastic, and very nice that you were in Otago visiting the birthplace of MitoQ, of our unique molecule, which I'm kind of curious to know how you first discovered mitoquinol mesylate, now known as MitoQ more commonly, and what kind of piqued your interest and why you decided you wanted to study it.
In the early 2000s, we were very interested in the possibility that antioxidants might help us promote healthy cardiovascular aging. We had tried conventional vitamins such as vitamin C, vitamin E, but those vitamins were shown to not have any effect by us and other laboratories. So we were searching for an antioxidant that had more promise than those more common antioxidant, over-the-counter antioxidants that have been tried. And we heard about this mitochondrial acting antioxidant, and we had done some work on mitochondrial physiology and knew the importance of mitochondria as producers of reactive oxygen species, and that was a location, if you could position an antioxidant close to the mitochondria that were producing these reactive oxygen species, that made inherent sense to us that this might actually help cardiovascular health be promoted. So we started actually with preclinical studies on mice. And our initial study, which was around 2010, we had reached out to Mike Murphy, one of the co-discoverers of MitoQ, and he was performing preclinical research at the time, and we formed a collaboration with him. And the company supplied us with MitoQ for those initial studies in mice. And basically what we did was we took groups of old mice and young mice, and half of the old mice and half of the young mice each received MitoQ in the drinking water for 3 weeks, while the other mice did not receive anything in their water. It was just placebo water, if you will. And after 3 weeks, the old mice that were taking MitoQ completely reversed the cardiovascular dysfunction that they had shown with aging. And we were really impressed by that. And so that was the original exposure to MitoQ and the original investigations that we undertook. And they were sort of proof of concept. So before you conduct a study in humans, if there's no evidence to go by, you can usually perform preclinical studies and try to design an investigation that provides some kind of proof before you move on to human subjects. And that's how we started.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so then moving on to that human clinical trial, could you tell us a little bit about what you found with that and I guess a bit about the parameters of that study?
So in our case, we're what's called a translational physiology lab. And translational research just means, in most cases, moving from preclinical models, so studying events in cells or making observations in mice, and then based on that evidence, if it's promising, to then move that up to pilot studies, small trials in human subjects, and then larger and larger trials. So that's the way our laboratory conducts our research. And so after performing those mouse studies that we just talked about, we felt that the compound showed sufficient promise to try to translate, as we call it, the observations to people. And at that time, MitoQ started providing as a dietary supplement the current compound, which was not available, I think, when we were doing when we were doing the mouse studies. That compound wasn't available, so the timing was perfect. Just when we wanted to translate the observations to people, the compound became available commercially. And so we contacted the company and had them provide us with MitoQ and placebo capsules. And we were able to then conduct a pilot study that you mentioned. And this was a small study, and it's what they call a crossover study. So you randomize volunteers at the very beginning to either 6 weeks of taking MitoQ or 6 weeks of taking the placebo control compound that shouldn't have any effect. And then after 6 weeks, they cross over and you take the other treatment, whatever that is. So we conducted that study and found that the individuals that took MitoQ for 6 weeks, after they took the MitoQ, that they had a significant improvement in vascular function, vascular health. Whereas the group that took the placebo did not have any change at all. So that's sort of your control condition to make sure that there's no effect of just being in the study. So those were very promising results, and that was just one of our observations that we found an improvement in vascular health. And so that provided now a foundation of results in humans that we could continue to try to translate to then a larger study and so on. And that's kind of how the process works.
So can you tell us a little bit about what the study found, the kind of benefits?
Sure. So the primary outcome measure, which is sort of clinical trials jargon for the main measurement, the main result that you were looking at, is something called vascular endothelial function. And that's a fancy term to describe the health of the lining of our arteries. So all of our arteries at the interface between the inner layer of the artery and where blood flows, in what we call the lumen of the artery, there's a single layer of cells called endothelial cells. And they're very important to promote the health of the artery because they manufacture and release into the bloodstream or into the artery a variety of important bioactive molecules. So you can measure the health of that lining by stimulating the artery to dilate, which just basically means to widen. And in the conditions that we're talking about, the greater the induced dilation, the more healthy that endothelial lining is, because the stimulus actually causes the endothelial cells to release the molecules that eventually cause the artery to widen. So an endothelial lining that is not healthy won't produce enough of the molecules to dilate the artery, or at least dilate it as much. So our main measure was simply how much the artery would dilate when we stimulated these endothelial cells to produce the molecules that they should produce. And that was impressively improved with the 6 weeks of MitoQ. We also measured another important assessment of arterial health, and that's the stiffness of the arteries. So as we age, for example, our arteries tend to stiffen, and that drives up our blood pressure and causes a lot of other problems. And we also found that MitoQ reduced a standard reference measure of arterial stiffness. So we consider the endothelial function, the dilation capacity, and arterial stiffness to be the two most important changes that occur to our arteries with aging. And both of those were improved.
And so presumably that then has a knock-on beneficial impact on your heart health?
Yes.
Any other areas of the body? Mostly are we talking kind of about heart health?
Well, mostly heart health is mostly heart health is the other cardiovascular component of the arteries and how they function. It turns out that the heart does undergo changes with aging, and many of those changes are adverse, but they're all driven primarily by changes to arteries. So the idea is if you can promote arterial health by whatever strategy, then you're also going to have an impact on the heart. It's also possible, because the arteries are the blood vessels that provide blood from the heart, when the heart pumps blood out into the circulation, the arteries are the vessels that carry that oxygenated blood with all their nutrients and delivers that blood to all of your tissues and organs and cells. So it's possible that by improving arterial health, you can improve a variety of other functions of the body. Your muscles need blood flow when you are active and you need to move around. Very fundamental processes throughout the body require this oxygenated, rich nutrient blood. So in that sense, even though it hasn't been investigated yet, it's still the early part of investigations in this area, it is possible that we'll find many other positive health benefits because we have improved arterial health as a primary event.
It's kind of like the roots of a tree, isn't it?
Yeah.
A tree's not going to be healthy if
Yeah.
its roots aren't healthy.
And brain health would be part of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The health of the brain is very importantly influenced by the health of the arteries.
I can imagine. So, you sort of said it's in the early stages, and I think a lot of people probably don't necessarily appreciate that with things like clinical trials, which can take kind of 3 years, 4 years, maybe even longer, this is considered to be not a particularly long amount of time. So MitoQ, that study was done in 2018. Presumably the mouse study was done, a good number of years earlier.
Right.
But in the scheme of scientific kind of research, that's quite normal. But I guess there are a lot of people out there who don't necessarily appreciate what a clinical trial is and how it's funded.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and explain to people, the difference between a clinical trial versus something that maybe is just, customer testimonials or things like that.
Right. There's a huge difference. So what they call a randomized clinical trial, you'll see it abbreviated RCT, right? Though that's considered the gold standard of investigations on human research that involves treatments. And those treatments could be prescription drugs, they could be various types of dietary supplements, they could be healthy lifestyle behaviors such as exercise or dietary restriction, eating a different diet, whatever the case is. But whatever the treatment is, the randomized clinical trial is designed to show the potential benefits of a treatment by isolating the effects of that treatment versus other effects. And what I mean by this is that if someone is given a drug or some type of dietary supplement, or they're asked to do some kind of physical activity or eat a certain type of diet, then they may feel that something has improved. And in fact, if you measure something, some function of the body, you may actually find that it has improved. The problem is that if the measurement is subjective, the person may respond that they feel better because they think they have taken something that should allow them to feel better or make them feel better. If it's the case where something's actually being measured, you don't know if the measurement is stable. So if you would have given them something that should have no effect at all, would they still show an improvement in that measurement? So that's called a time control. And so measurements can change over time. So basically what a clinical trial does is it takes a group of individuals and randomly assigns them to either a treatment or a placebo control condition. And then they're put on those respective treatment conditions for some period of time. It may be 3 months, whatever. And then they're measured again at the end of it. And now you have a situation where the effects of the treatment can be compared to whatever effects you see in the control group. So a promising study, the kind of study results that you would like to have if you believe in a treatment and it's going to be successful, would be that the individuals put on the treatment condition that is sort of the experimental condition where they're actually receiving an active compound or whatever the treatment is that you think is going to produce benefit. If they show an improvement in a health outcome, for example, and the other group that's been on the placebo treatment does not, now you have a very clear picture and compelling evidence that the treatment may indeed be effective. But it's always compared to any changes that occur in the control condition. So if your measurement, we call it in science measurement drift. So if just so happens that whatever you're measuring actually improves, it doesn't really improve, but your measurement indicates it improves in the control group, you're always comparing the response in the treatment group directly against the control group. And this is a way that we can cut out a lot of these biases that are inherent to certain kinds of research or for sure to anecdotal observations that you pick up when you talk to somebody. Well, my friend took this and she feels so much better, right? That's interesting and that might be meaningful to you, but from a strictly medical science standpoint, it's of no real value, because what you always want to see are medical studies, more than one, whenever possible, that shows what we just talked about, that the treatment has a significant effect in improving a health outcome compared with the placebo control. So that's called a randomized controlled study, because you're controlling all the other factors except for the effects of your treatment.
It's so kind of impressive when you understand the rigor that goes into it.
Yeah.
And I think customer testimonials are really useful. Sort of testimonial trials are useful for putting things into consumer language.
Right.
But to have this body of robust scientific research as well just kind of adds to the picture, so you can talk to why some of those feelings are there. Is it very regular? I mean, MitoQ has currently 15 clinical trials that have been done on it, and there are, I think, about 40 that various institutes around the world are doing. How common is that for a dietary supplement to have that level of sort of clinical trials behind it?
I think it's relatively uncommon in our experience. So we study both healthy lifestyle strategies and also pharmacological strategies. And the pharmacological strategies are usually within the range of dietary supplements, including MitoQ. So we're pretty experienced in what goes on in that world. And the great majority of dietary supplements that are commercially available have no evidence whatsoever from any kind of research, much less randomized clinical trial, again, which is considered the gold standard for producing evidence of a health benefit. Again, most dietary supplements, if you walk into the grocer or the vitamin cottage or whatever it is, you'll see hundreds, perhaps thousands of dietary supplements. Relatively few of them have any research done on them. And then the most rarest event would be to have a clinical trial, or even more rare, several clinical trials on a particular compound or dietary supplement showing benefit. But that's really what you should look for. You should look for some type of research that's been well controlled to show a benefit, and ideally that research would then include a pilot clinical trial, and then eventually larger clinical trials that meet these standards for rigor, like you mentioned. That's really, then you have confidence. But most of the great majority, as I said, do not have any research at all on it. So I think this is very unusual.
So you talked to a larger scale clinical trial, which I believe you guys are in is it a phase 2 trial, or I'm not sure what it's called, but could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, trial? And I'll just mention in as part of the response, you cannot perform research without funding, without grant funding. And especially clinical research is very expensive. So if I can just take a half step back to tackle absolutely. Your question, when we first started out with the mouse work, that was largely unfunded. So we funded that essentially internally from other laboratory sources. But once we had the positive data, the promising data from the mice that I mentioned, then we took those data and we applied to our National Institutes of Health, which is our huge biomedical funding organization in the United States. And they fund 90-something% of all biomedical research that occurs in the U.S., and that's a lot of research. So, tens of billions of dollars, right? And what we did was we applied for a pilot grant to study MitoQ in humans, and that was the pilot study we were talking about. And we received a 2-year pilot grant from the National Institutes of Health. Then we conducted that study, and as we talked about, we obtained promising results from that pilot trial. And then we took those data from the pilot trial, those promising results, and we used them as what we call preliminary data to try to fund a larger trial. So we wrote an application, and the data from the pilot study were sort of key promissory notes showing that we do believe the compound works and it improves these aspects of cardiovascular health, and that was funded. And so that's a 5-year, approximately $2 to $2.5 million grant, and it is currently supporting a phase 2, what we call a phase 2, which is the next step up, investigation, a randomized clinical trial of MitoQ versus placebo control. And instead of people crossing over for those 6-week periods, we're having people stay on MitoQ for 12 weeks. And so the randomization is that you either go into the MitoQ treatment group or to the placebo control group for 3 months. And you're measured before and after in terms of cardiovascular health markers. We're in the second year of that 5-year study now. So that, again, you can see how the research has grown from what we call preclinical research in animal models to a small human investigation, and now we're at that next step. And then what we'd like to do, if you want me to go there, if we see promising results in this larger clinical trial, then the next step might be to try to obtain funding for a multi-center trial. And that means that instead of a single institution, a single laboratory like mine, performing the trial, there would be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different sites at other universities, and they would all be following the same protocol. And that is really the ultimate
The diamond standard.
hallmark, right, the holy grail of randomized clinical trial-based evidence is when you perform a multi-center randomized clinical trial, and when you put all of the evidence together from all of the sites, you are now showing a treatment effect. Because what that means is that it could not have been done, it could not have been due to some kind of artifact or some kind of odd effect of having the study done at a single site if everybody is showing the same thing. So that's how we'd like to see the progression, and we're actually probably one step from that with our current trial.
So with the current trial, when you say it's larger, it's more participants?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. More
And
participants.
just coming back to the kind of funding aspect, not just anyone can rock up and apply for this funding. You have to show promising results from the previous trial to get sort of access to the next one. And so I think, a lot of people don't really understand that, the clinical trials are independently funded. They sort of have nothing to do with MitoQ, and likewise we have absolutely, apart from providing the MitoQ product to you guys, we have no influence in the outcomes, no involvement in the trial. It's just, here's the product, and cross our fingers and hope.
Yeah, I mean, some clinical trials, we're talking in general now, are funded by pharmaceutical companies. So these are prescription medications. They are often funded by the pharmaceutical companies. But in the case of dietary supplements like this, and in the case of our laboratory, we have always obtained NIH grants, National Institutes of Health grants, to do this work. And it's a quite rigorous process, actually. And the folks out there may not know that in general, what you do is you write an application and you submit it to this grant funding organization, and then they identify what they call peer reviewers. So they're scientists like me with expertise in my area, and they received my grant application, and 3 or 4 of those scientists are assigned to review, to evaluate my grant application. And in that system, only 1 out of every 10 grants are approved. So it's highly competitive. It's a very rigorous review process. The same process goes on in New Zealand and Australia and Europe. So this is an international standard for how countries, for example, use the tax dollars of their citizens to disperse for biomedical research. They have these expert review teams that rigorously review the applications, and then they make decisions. They score those applications, and again, only the very best applications are funded. So it's very challenging.
Yeah, I imagine, and also incredible. So, I mean, jumping back to the 2018 trial, I believe that sort of found that MitoQ significantly fights oxidative stress, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why that is important for cardiovascular health.
Sure. So oxidative stress, if you wanted to try to define it and keep it in somewhat lay language, would be an excessive production of what we call reactive oxygen species. Sometimes in the popular press they're called free radicals, but I think reactive oxygen species are probably the best way to describe them. And these are derivatives of molecular oxygen that happen to be chemically changed in a way that they damage other molecules and they disrupt the healthy function of your cells and your tissues and your organs. So oxidative stress, if we keep an example of healthy aging, for example, oxidative stress, we think, and there's good evidence to suggest this, that the development of oxidative stress with aging is really what's driving the loss of cardiovascular health with advancing age. And it can stimulate inflammation, which is sort of its culprit in crime. The two stimulate each other once they're generated, and it becomes what we call a vicious cycle. And that leads to cardiovascular dysfunction and a loss of cardiovascular health. So oxidative stress is a setting in which we're producing too many of these reactive oxygen species, an excessive number. There's a proper number, and that actually is important for physiological signaling and health and function. But then when you produce an excessive amount compared to your antioxidant defenses, so the body does have defenses to neutralize these reactive oxygen species, but in some cases, and aging is one of them, the body just produces too much and the antioxidant defenses can't keep up. So there becomes an unbalance. And so then the state that is developed is called oxidative stress, because you have these reactive oxygen species in such abundance that they are damaging your cells and your tissues and your organs. And that leads to a loss of proper function and a loss of health.
Yeah, we at MitoQ tend to refer to it as cell stress because, we're on this mission to educate people that they are almost entirely made of cells. And so if you've got stress going on within those cells, that's basically stress going on within your body.
Right.
And we know that the sort of more, clinical term for cell stress brings in environmental damage and things like that, but that oxidative stress is the biggest contributor to cell stress.
Yes.
So, fantastic. Back to the arterial dilation. We know, and you were talking previously about clinical trials are done in many things, exercise, healthy diet, and we know obviously that they have incredible benefits for the cardiovascular system, for your arteries. And so how did the activity of the MitoQ kind of compare with what you would normally expect to see with maybe diet improvements, exercise improvements, things like that?
Before we started studying any dietary supplements, we performed investigations for decades on healthy lifestyle behaviors, including aerobic exercise and low sodium diets and dietary restriction, going on a diet with weight loss. So we really had a good reference point with how those healthy lifestyle strategies improved our arterial function, including the capacity of the arteries to dilate. So we had a good foundation of points of reference there. So when we performed the pilot investigation with MitoQ, the first study, we found that the improvements in dilator capacity were very much in keeping with what we see with healthy lifestyle behaviors, including aerobic exercise, sodium restriction, and going on a diet, and with the accompanying weight loss. So we were really surprised because that was the first time that we had ever studied a dietary supplement that had the same kind of impact that we could invoke with those healthy lifestyle behaviors. So I think that's one of the things that stands out with our MitoQ pilot study and what we're hoping to be able to recapitulate with the current larger clinical trial.
Amazing. And obviously, at MitoQ we advocate for a varied approach to health, and obviously good diet and exercise are a huge part of that, but our hope is adding the MitoQ just gives you that next level, but obviously there are people who perhaps can't exercise as much as they should, and so I guess this also helps those people too. Yeah,
and that's really why we started performing research on dietary supplements, was because even though we had shown at a certain point that all of these healthy lifestyle behaviors are very powerful strategies to improve cardiovascular health with aging, the unfortunate truth is that if you look at the number of people that follow guidelines that are promoted by medical organizations or the government on how much to exercise, how to control your diet, how to eat a healthy diet, the number of people that actually follow those guidelines, especially in midlife and older age, are well under 50%. So when I would present our data on the healthy lifestyle strategies. A lot of physicians would come up to me afterwards and say, that's great, but my patients won't do that. What else do you have for me? And that's kind of an anecdotal story, but that's the truth. And after hearing that for many, many years after my presentations on exercise and healthy diet practice, I finally decided that there were tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people that for whatever reason either couldn't engage in those behaviors or wouldn't engage in those behaviors. And there are a lot of reasons that we could talk about why people don't do that. In some cases they simply can't, because they can't afford healthy food, or they don't have access to healthy food, or they have some disability in terms of exercise. But the point is that I felt we needed to create evidence-based alternative approaches. And that is really what led to our research on dietary supplements, which now includes over a decade of investigation with MitoQ. That's a true story.
Wow, that is amazing. It's, we are talking about aging, but is this something that only old people need to be concerned about? Like what ages should people be prioritizing these kinds of things?
So one of the things I mentioned at the very beginning was our interest in promoting cardiovascular health throughout the lifespan. But really, I should narrow that to say throughout the adult lifespan in a way, because you're sort of protected until you become an adult. We're not exactly sure why, but that's the time when your health is very strong and resistant to losing it. But the process by which the cardiovascular system becomes dysfunctional and loses that healthy profile actually occurs over decades. And it probably starts even in the 20s or the 30s, could even happen in the late teens. There's evidence that soldiers from the Korean War that were killed, upon autopsy, they found cholesterol plaques in many of their arteries, and these were late teens, early 20s soldiers that had been killed. And so there's good evidence that from a cardiovascular standpoint, the threat to maintaining cardiovascular health begins in young adulthood, and then as time goes on, probably because of issues like developing more and more oxidative stress that we talked about earlier, it becomes more and more difficult to maintain cardiovascular health. But it does not start at a specific age. Some people will be protected because of their genetic profile or their lifestyle behaviors or whatever, but that process is occurring in everyone. And at some point, even if you live a healthy lifestyle and engage in healthy practices, there is some consequence of the aging process. The arteries, for example, will begin to stiffen even in those folks that exercise regularly and eat healthy. Mm-hmm. So I think maintaining cardiovascular health throughout the lifespan, or throughout the adult lifespan, that's how folks should consider, if they want to be healthy when they're in their older ages, that needs to start earlier. You can't spend the first 3 or 4 decades of adulthood engaging in unhealthy behaviors and then say, well, I'll start.
I'll get to it when I'm 40.
To it. Yeah. Because some of the damage has already been done, and some of it is irreversible.
So then, jumping to that question,
sure.
What are the things that people can, the measures people should be taking and then kind of setting in stone early on?
Yeah, so I've given a couple of public lectures, one in Australia and one in New Zealand on this recently on this trip. And if I could give any health advice based on the evidence, now this is not me overstepping my bounds, but just based on what the research literature says, the science, aerobic exercise probably would be the first thing that I mention, regular aerobic exercise, because simply that has the most evidence that it has promising cardiovascular health benefits. And then I think a healthy diet, which we've talked about, and that could be viewed as how much you eat or what you eat, or both. Right? And so making sure that you don't eat too much for that part of healthy diet, and that you have good weight management. So we tend to gain a pound or two or a kilogram here maybe every year or two throughout the adult lifespan. So making sure that you do whatever the case is to either prevent or minimize that slow age-related weight gain, I think is also helpful. We also know a lot about what a healthy diet composition is. So independent of how much you eat, there's of course what you eat. And we know a lot about that now. We know about the kinds of foods that are healthy. We read about these things. I think just eating healthy foods, not being too subjective or reactive to fad diets, I think that's a real problem that has spawned internationally, is people grabbing on to fad diets.
So great.
And also exercise is a very important part of dietary health, because they've shown that that people that exercise have a much easier time managing their weight. If they have to lose weight, it's a key determinant of whether they keep the weight off versus regain the weight. So I think healthy diet and exercise work hand in hand. If you're unable to do those types of healthy lifestyle behaviors, and again, as we talked about, certain individuals have more of a challenge in doing that, then I think some of the dietary supplements that we've been studying at some point certainly can be considered. They talk to their doctor and suggest that they want to maintain their cardiovascular health and have those conversations with them. So again, the work that we're doing on dietary supplements is meant to provide alternatives to the individuals in the community and to their general practice doctors.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've sort of have clinical trials on MitoQ and energy production and then recovery from exercise and things like that. And our hope is, that for people who maybe are struggling with exercise, that it actually becomes a tool to help them keep exercising regularly and maybe get more out of it, because they don't feel as bad afterwards as well.
Yeah. And there are people that really do not respond well, and we don't to exercise, that find it very unpleasant. And we're finding out now that they're, like with everything else, there is a biology to that. So I think it's important to consider different demographics and characteristics of people when we try to help them, for example, maintain cardiovascular health throughout the aging process. We need to be mindful of the limitations there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to put you on the spot now. Yeah. So talk us through your kind of healthy living routine.
Yeah, so mine is based on what we really just talked about: regular exercise and also eating a healthy diet. So I perform a combination of aerobic and resistance exercise throughout the week, switching off usually day to day, and then try to maintain a healthy diet. Again, both the amount of food that I eat and then making sure that I'm eating primarily healthy foods. And that combination works for me. I think each individual is different. They're biologically different. Their lifestyle is different. Their demands from a family perspective. But for me, that's a combination that really works. And so that's my foundation of health, or my foundational strategy.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, it's so fantastic to have you here visiting us in New Zealand. Thank you so much for coming into the MitoQ head offices to meet us and to talk to us. And we look forward to catching up again soon. And good luck with the phase 2 trial.
Yeah. Thank you. It was a pleasure.